What I am trying to do is to reach evangelical women who honestly think that God has placed limits on them because of their sex. And I want them to hear that they can reconsider that and still be a faithful Christian.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Beth.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah.
So this is Beth Allison Barr. She has her PhD from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, where she specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. She is the president of the Conference on Faith and History and is a member of Christians for Biblical Equality. Barr has written for Christianity Today, The Washington Post, and Religion News Service, and is a regular contributor to The Anxious Bench, which is a popular Patheos, is that how you say that?
Patheos.
Okay. Website on Christian history. So welcome. And I heard that you have an appropriate mug here today with your coffee.
I do. So I am from Baylor and I have my national championship. We won the national championship in basketball this year. And I actually really don't care all that much about sports, but this is a big deal. So I have a national championship mug, which fits my morning coffee. I can pour almost my whole pot of Chemex in this mug in the morning. So I also like it because it fits all of my coffee in the morning.
Perfect. And I have, we were just talking before we started recording about Goshen College, and I actually have a Goshen College mug here. And I picked it. I like to kind of tie my mugs in with a theme if I can. And I was like, I think Goshen was maybe when I learned more egalitarian, even liberationist ideas about women in the Bible. And so I was like, I think Goshen College is a fitting mug choice.
It's appropriate.
Yeah.
Mine's just about winning a basketball championship. So
that works. I love it. Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast, so I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. And today we will be talking about your book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. So pretty. I have I feel bad, I get a new pretty book and I love it, but I can't help but just write in it. I underlined a whole bunch. I have my own system of stars and question marks and exclamation points. And but anyways, we are talking about the making of biblical womanhood, how the subjugation of women became gospel truth. And as per usual, we start off by defining our terms. So there's 3 terms that come up a lot in the book that may be useful to define, and that's patriarchy, complementarianism, and egalitarianism. And I'm also curious how these concepts interact with the idea of biblical womanhood. So if you want to start us off.
Yeah, no, that's great. So in fact, I was just reading some comments from a local pastor in my hometown about my use of patriarchy and conflation with complementarianism. And so this is actually really good. I think this is probably the hardest swallow of my book for people who are completely unfamiliar with how patriarchy is constructed. And so I think it's really shocking for them to think that what we're doing in the church is just patriarchy. So what patriarchy is, it is simply social structures. It is systemic structures that are created by culture, by society, by laws that always place women under the power of men. I mean, that's essentially, it's really simple. They exist in different ways. One of the consistency in history is that patriarchy is always there. It's there from the very beginning of civilization, but it exists in different ways because it is not, it is something that, it conforms to each different society, which is also something that I was trying to hit hard in my book to help people understand that this isn't a gospel constructed idea. This is a people constructed idea that changes according to how we live. So that's what patriarchy is. Complementarianism is a recent manifestation of patriarchy. It's Christian patriarchy. It's not the only form of Christian patriarchy, but it's a most recent manifestation that is very prominent in modern evangelicalism, American evangelicalism, especially Southern American evangelicalism. It's really where it's rooted. And it is this idea that patriarchy is God ordained, that God has ordained from the beginning of time, that's part of complementarianism, that women are to be under the power of men. Some people don't like the use of the word power, but if you think about it, I mean, power is when somebody else is able to make decisions and is able to put limits on another person. And so men who are able to make decisions in a church without female input, and men are able to say that women can or cannot lead in certain ways, that's power. Right. And so they have power. Complementarianism is claiming that there is God ordained power of men over women in church and home. And then egalitarianism, and this is also a modern term. I sort of, as a historian, on the one hand, I'm fully for egalitarian ideas, but I stumble over the word too, because it is such a modern word. I'm sort of like, what I am for is simply women being able to do whatever God has called them to do. And in our modern evangelical terms, we call this egalitarianism, simply this idea that women are created equal with men, not only spiritually equal, but also equal in every manifestation of society. And so God does not place limits on women. That's actually how I would explain egalitarianism, is that God does not place limits on women. And so that's really what the type of egalitarian that I am. It also can be explained in marriages as mutuality. I can't say that word. Mutuality? But mutuality. Yeah. There you are. See, there you are. It's okay. You don't have to edit that out. I'm perfectly okay with my faux pas. But it's a good word. It's a word that I don't say out loud very much, but it's simply this idea that women and men have a mutual relationship. Right. And that there's not sort of this hierarchy in marriage. It's just you work together as a team. Yeah. And the power dynamics fluctuates depending on the different situations. And that to me is the plan that God outlined. I mean, if we look at Genesis and we look at the creation story, the mutual relationship of Adam and Eve just seems to color that entire passage. And it shocks me that we miss it today. Right.
Yeah, I was talking with some of my friends about doing this interview, and I was telling them about this book, and I said, it's written for an evangelical audience, but I realized like these ideas of complementarianism and patriarchy, it's not just within evangelical circles, like it seeps out. Like when as you were talking, it like unlocked this memory in my brain of when I was at Heston College before I went to Goshen College. And I was interested in this young man, and he handed me this book. I think it was I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Oh, by Joshua Harris.
It was that, or it was some book about like courting and how like men and women have their distinct roles. And I read it and I was like, I guess this makes sense. Like there was something that wasn't quite right, but there was logic there. And I was like, okay. But then I like would argue with him about how I still wanted to be a pastor. Anyways, the relationship didn't go far, but I was like, oh yeah, this has definitely impacted my life. Even technically outside of the evangelical tradition.
Yes. Yeah.
And there was another time in college when a peer of mine came up to me and he was like, oh, so you're in the Bible and religion major. And I was like, yeah, I want to be a pastor. And he's like, well, how do you reconcile that with the passages in the Bible that say that women need to be silent in the church? And I had no idea what he was talking about. Like, I had never heard verses before. I like mumbled something about like new covenant in Jesus. Like I thought he was talking about like Old Testament, like Hebrew law or something. And he was like, he could tell I didn't know what I was talking about. And it really like threw me because no one had ever said like, hey, your gender may play a role in your calling. And so I went to my dad, who was a pastor, and I went to Michelle Hirschberger, who was professor of Bible. And I was like, what does this mean? Does God not want me to be a pastor? Like it was.
Oh, yeah.
And so that started my interest in like gender studies. And I'm leading towards a question here, but I forget what my question here.
Of course, you sparked a question for me. I want to know what they said to you. What the answer? Yeah.
Well, I remember that Michelle Hirschberger told me her story of being a pastor. And then I think it's okay to say on here, but then she was pushed out of her church and there were women standing up in the church. And you've pointed this out in the book at one point, the irony of women pushing often vocally for women's silence and subjugation.
Right.
And it was the women who were not comfortable with her being pastor. I think she was like co-pastor with a man or something.
Right.
And so then she ended up leaving that church. But I don't remember. There was not like one piece that I was like, oh, okay, I'm okay with this. But like having two people like my dad and Michelle say, yes, it's okay for you to be called.
Okay.
That was enough for me. And then I started writing papers and like actually doing my own
exploring it
work and exploring, and then felt okay with it. And then I
felt
impassioned and like angry, like how dare anyone say that I cannot do this, because that's not how I was raised. So yeah,
that's great.
It did feed that fire. But yeah, thankfully there's so many women who, you talk about your cloud of witnesses of the saints, so many women who paved the way so that I could have a relatively easy time getting up on the pulpit. So yeah, okay, here's the question finally. How would you advise a young woman starting out in ministry to handle, types of conversations when people challenge her place in the pulpit?
Right. So I think there's often, the women that I have talked with about this, it depends on the background that they come from. Mm-hmm. Most of the women that I have talked with about this are coming from where they have grown up hearing these verses. They have grown up hearing women be silent, and they have grown up hearing that women should not teach or have authority over men. And that's actually the biggest one. And so, our passages in Timothy and Titus are often the ones that I find the women in my circles that they hear the most. 1 Corinthians also, but nonetheless, so I think women growing up in those, but they feel a calling by God, they have a lot of tension in their lives. And many of these women actually end up doing ministry, but they end up doing ministry in different areas. Like one of the ones that I was very close to became a missionary, because that allowed her to be able to do what she wanted to do, what she felt God calling her to do without limits. I mean, that's the thing. Missionaries are really interesting if you fit them into this whole picture. It's a place where women can safely go do what God has called them to do without having pushback until they come home. And so that's interesting. But when the women come to me and talk to me about this, I try to break it down for them in two ways. And first of all, like, why do you feel God calling you? I mean, that's always, anyone who has a vocation, we need to think about, why do you feel this? Do you feel pressure on you in some ways? Or is there something, is this something that you feel this passion inside that has come from your own reading of scripture, has come from your own experiences with God, has come from other people in your life who have inspired you to consider, and also your own gifting? Is this something? So break down, like, why do you want to do this? And then we're like, okay, so if God calls you to do this, then where do we see in scripture women being called by God. And sometimes it's just shifting that perspective. I mean, our perspective is so closed by these handful of verses, it's 5 main verses, 6. It depends on how you count the household codes. I mean, there's several household codes, but they're all pretty much saying the same thing. So anyway, but there's this handful of verses that have constricted women. And if you are able to peel back those verses and say, yes, these verses are here, we're not going to discount them, but let's put them in context of what else is going on in the Bible. And that is usually, enough to allow women who come talk to me to be like, oh, there's more to the story. Mm-hmm. And that is, whether or not they ultimately decide to go into ministry or decide that calling on their life is one they want to embrace or one that's actually happening, at least they know that there is a bigger story than what they have been told. And that's really what I was trying to do with my book, was to help people know there's a bigger story.
Yeah, you're that person. You're my dad and Michelle for so many other people when they have these questions of like, is it faithful to, is God okay with this? You're saying, yes, go be free. We'll get to that.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And in your NPR interview, which is also like so cool that you got to be in NPR. That's amazing.
Yes, it is. It's crazy.
You talked about how rather than upholding patriarchy as a model for faithfulness, God is always fighting patriarchy.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by that. So yeah, do you want to go into that a little bit?
So, this is definitely something that as a scholar, this is I knew I was taking a little bit of a risk stating this as a scholar, because we cannot discount the fact that the Bible is written in a patriarchal world. Many patriarchal cultures feed into the Bible. And in all of those cultures, women are under the authority of men. And so by saying that God fights against patriarchy, I'm not discounting the fact that patriarchy fills the Bible. If we just start reading the Old Testament, it's very discouraging, some of the ways that we see. But what is interesting is that within that very patriarchal world, we have stories like Tamar and Rahab. And my husband was even preaching a little bit on, my husband's a pastor. I don't feel called to the vocation of being a pastor. I feel called to helping other women be able to live out their calling. So yeah, people are like, well, don't you want to preach? And I'm like, no, I really don't want to preach. But I want to help other women preach. Yeah. So anyway, so my husband, he was preaching and he had the story of David and Bathsheba in there. And I was thinking about Bathsheba and I was like, it is really fascinating how Bathsheba is named in this story. And that, because if you really think about the story does not need Bathsheba named. It does not need her at all. David the story's about David, really, or that's the sort of male perspective. The story's about David and what David has done. But God does not let Bathsheba go unnamed. He brings her into the story. And also, if you think about the part where David has, David, the child dies, the initial child out of the rape. There's no question that this is not Bathsheba is not complicit in this. Yeah, she is raped and her husband is murdered. And so, it's this horrible story. But then God, it's amazing. God makes Bathsheba the mother of the greatest king of the Hebrew people, of the Jewish people. And so I think that is just, that even a story, if you think about it historically, I think it's the power of God not letting this woman's story be told without her in it and letting her be named as the mother of Solomon. That's really incredible. You can think about this too, like the genealogy of Jesus. The 4 women who are named, 5 women, of course, Mary, but the 4 Old Testament women who are named in this, they are not women of good repute. These are not our Proverbs 31, what we think about as our Proverbs 31 women. These are women, we have Rahab, we have a prostitute. We have Tamar, who acts like a prostitute. And then we have Ruth, who we try to make this into this beautiful evangelical story, and then we figure out what uncovering feet actually are.
Yeah.
And then we're like, she's a forward woman. She's like
Right.
what your grandmother would tell you not to do, And so, but this is clearly, anyway, if you think about that story, and really you're like, Boaz is like, whoa, what are you doing? But anyway, but she feels, clearly God is working in her life for her to become in the lineage of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Bathsheba.
Yeah.
And so God uses women in unexpected and powerful ways, and he doesn't let them go unnamed. I think about the story of Hagar, which is also another terrible story. This woman, again, who is raped, who is used against her will without any of her, knowledge. And then she's cast out for doing what they wanted her to do.
Right.
And in Exodus, God comes to her and says, I'm going to take care of you. And she names God. I mean, this is powerful. She names God. She says, God sees women, and God doesn't let women go unprotected, and God doesn't let women stay silent in their own stories.
Right.
And so if that's not fighting against patriarchy, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think my favorite response, if like anyone would question women behind the pulpit, just point to the women of the Bible. I mean, like all the women named, Esther, the women who were disciples of Jesus, Phoebe, and well, I'm not naming Phoebe as a disciple of Jesus, but
right. Oh, I know what you're saying.
Listing all these women.
The early church.
What's that?
Yeah, the early church.
Yeah. Yeah. And just all of these women that were part of the story of God. And
right.
And also that, like, at least at this point in my life, no one can stop me from getting up in the pulpit and preaching about these women. You can say what you want, but I will still go up there and I won't be silent. And I'm not going to go home. I'm going to be in the pulpit. You provide, speaking of women, you provide many examples of women doing ministry throughout Christian history, especially in the Middle Ages. And so do you have a favorite example, or a woman that is kind of, in your cloud of witnesses, I guess, a woman that has struck you as a source of inspiration? And I was personally inspired by Margaret, I think it was
Marjorie. Oh, Margaret, the Dragon Slayer.
Yes, the Dragon Slayer. I was like, that's so amazing. But yeah, do you have kind of like a favorite or an inspiration?
But probably for this, my story might be one of my favorite women. I've written an article on her, but her name is Winifred. My dog's actually named after her too, but I didn't intend that. We got the dog named from the pound, but I thought that was prophetic that was her name. Mm-hmm. But Winifred was from the early Middle Ages, and she's this woman who lives almost on the border of Wales, who feels God calling her into ministry. And her uncle, who's a preacher, takes her in and recognizes her call. But she because she is of a more aristocratic family, there's a local lord who wants to marry her, and he attempts to rape her to force her to marry him. And she fights him. She literally jumps out the window of her house and runs away from him. And he catches up with her on a hill, and he's so mad that she won't marry him that he cuts off her head. And I mean, so it's this potentially very traumatic. I mean, it is a traumatic story. But then it becomes really miraculous. I love telling this story because her head rolls down the hill into the church where her uncle is preaching, and her uncle sees the head of his niece roll in, and he's of course horrified. He walks out to figure out what happens. He sees this aristocratic, this lord's son, who clearly is a murderous bully, standing on the hill. He calls down the wrath of God, and God literally opens up the ground, and this guy falls into hell. I mean, it's this dramatic story. Then he gets the body of Winifred, brings her back to the church, puts her head on top of her body, and asks the church to pray. and God resurrects Winifred. Her head reattaches to her body, and she spends the next 15 years preaching. It's this great story. So I love the story of Winifred because, I mean, obviously I don't, as a historian, the miraculous aspects of it are, the story of it, but the story medieval people, what they heard behind it was that God used women and would not allow women called by God to be prevented from their calling by men.
Yeah.
And that's a really powerful thing for any Christians to hear, but especially in the early medieval world.
Right. Well, you might have just answered this next question, but I'm curious, what was the most surprising finding throughout your studies in biblical womanhood as both a historian and a Christian? And you kind of have at the end of the book, and I don't want to spoil it, but we can talk about it if you want. You kind of have this, what I think of as a mic drop moment when you talk about the heresy that has kind of been swept under the rug.
Oh,
So I don't know if you want to talk about that, if that was the most surprising thing, or if there was something else that, you dropped your coffee when you thought about it. So
yes, that was, I don't think that was my most surprising thing in sort of the research that I have in the book. That's my most surprising moment from the evangelical, sort of how much the evangelical world has bought into the idea of complementarianism so much that they see it in the Trinity and they don't realize that that is heretical. Right. And so what we're talking about here is something called the eternal subordination of the Son. That's one of the names. It's called lots of different things, but essentially it is a very old heresy. And I use the heresy Arianism sort of broad brush. And what Arianism is, it was the Council of Nicaea from the very beginning, was convened to fight Arianism. And so this is how, our very first ecumenical council was called to fight Arianism, which just shows us how much of a problem it was, and how serious it was. And what there was, I always, I tell my students, there was this priest in Alexandria in the late 3rd, early 4th century, and his name was Arius, and he converted a lot of the sailors. Alexandria was a port city, and there's all these sailors in there and stuff. And he sort of had a jingle. We don't get this as much anymore because I grew up, of course, in the age of commercials. And so, we know what jingles are, I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid, and things like that we never forget. Well, he invented a jingle that essentially was, there was a time when the Son was not. There was a time when Jesus didn't exist. And what he argued was that Jesus was literally the Son of God, that Jesus was eternal, that he was created, that he was a different substance than God the Father, and that he was a created being, and that he was eternally subordinate to God the Father because of this. So Arianism has lots of different forms. Sometimes it has this created being part in it, where Jesus is literally the Son of God the Father. You can think about Jehovah's Witnesses, that this carries on. And then sometimes part of Arianism is this emphasis on the subordination of the Son. So sometimes they both go together. They usually, if you argue for the created being, you always also argue for subordination. But sometimes we have this sort of partial subordinate Arianism that argues for the subordination bit. And that's what we see in the modern church, modern evangelicalism. And it is this argument that Jesus has a different role from God the Father, and that different role is always subordinate to God the Father. The reason this argument was made was not because there is it's not because this is needed in the Trinity, not because there's anything, the reason it was argued was to emphasize why women should be subordinate to men. Its argument is stemmed in this gender debate. And people can get mad about that and argue with me about that, but you just go look at history. You just go look when it arose, when it became important. It became important because of this gender debate. And so I will argue you on that from the historical evidence. And what it says is that because Jesus is always subordinate to God the Father, women should always be subordinate to their husbands, because are we better than Jesus? Isn't it prideful of us to say that we have a better role than what Jesus had? I mean, that's really the argument.
Right.
It's to keep women in their place. And what's so shocking about it is that it has been declared a heresy from the very beginning of the early church. And that if you follow the logic of this, what it does is it undermines salvation. The reason salvation works is because Jesus is God, because Jesus is fully God.
Right.
And this undermines Jesus being fully God. I mean, it's serious. And yet evangelicals have bought it hook, line, and sinker, as the common phrase is, because it supports this gender ideology. So that is shocking. And it's shocking that so many people still, in fact, as I said, I was reading a review of a local pastor this morning who was like, yeah, on the one hand, I understand why people would be shocked about Arianism, but that's also what's in the gospel. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like, it's not. So it has become so part of evangelical culture that we don't realize our theology has been corrupted to support a human system of oppression.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's shocking.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, I don't even know.
I know.
I
mean, what's funny too is that there's a lot of very conservative women who still argue for male headship and would not argue for women to be priests, that have been calling out this heresy because of its Christological significance and its significance to the gospel. And like Rachel Green Miller, who wrote a book called Subordination Without Hierarchy or something like that. But she started calling this out in the early 2000s. Amy Bird, who wrote a very controversial book called Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And these women would still argue women shouldn't be pastors, but they call out the heresy of ESS and ESF. So.
Huh, interesting. Well, yeah, and part of that is like I could see how they would relate it to like the household codes and like the hierarchy.
Right.
Yeah, do you want to, I was going to ask, do you want to touch briefly, which I don't even know if that's possible because I wrote entire papers. Household.
We talk about Paul.
I know, yeah. But, and I'm also curious because at least last I knew, Ephesians was like maybe written by Paul. Like there is some argument, but does that just not matter because it's just widely accepted as Paul's writing?
Yeah,
okay.
I really don't think that's I mean, for evangelicals, that's, these,
not a conversation.
And as a medieval historian, these were always accepted as Pauline texts, from very early on. And so as a historian, that's not my argument, sort of thing, is that these have always been understood as Pauline letters, and or at least part of the Pauline teachings. And so that hasn't, so I don't know. I think that's an argument that biblical scholars have because it's important in different ways, but it doesn't really matter to this overarching argument. And as a historian, as I said, I haven't seen any reason to get into that argument because everybody reads these as Paul. From the early church on, they're accepted as Paul.
Right.
And so, and because the household codes are in so many of these letters, that clearly this clearly is part of what's going on in the early church. So the question is, what's going on with them?
Right.
And what I argue in the book, and what a lot of scholars, regardless of whether or not they accept these as Pauline texts or not, argue, is that these household codes are not doing the same thing that Roman household codes are doing. And I really like Rachel Held Evans here, because she has this phrase that I quote in the book where she says these are a Jesus remix. And I love that, this remix. It's like this is the world in which we live. The world in which we live says women are subordinate to men. But let's look at that from the perspective of the gospel. And from the perspective of the gospel, this is what's so surprising about the household codes in the Bible, is they are not male-centered. They are not male-centered. Household codes in the Greco-Roman world are male-centered because they're speaking to men, about men, by men. It's men writing them for men about how these structures work in their homes and in the law, etc. And what we see in the gospel and what we see in the New Testament is these letters that are written to a community. They are written to husbands, wives, children, slaves, all, it shows us how diverse the context is of these early household churches. And it shows us too that they're like all meeting together because the text turn, they're bringing them all into the conversation. This is really surprising. They're bringing them, lots of people have talked about this. Now the Roman, as a scholar, I was kind of up here with sort of talking about in this book, as a scholar, I know that there were some, that there were a lot of women in the Roman world who were already sort of outside the bounds of patriarchy, but they always had to sort of justify it. Sort of like, why did they get to be outside of the power of men? It's because their fathers gave them that right. Mm-hmm. They let them get married without this authority. And so there's all these sorts of reasons, but what we see in the household codes in the Bible is sort of the Jesus authority about why women should be treated as spiritual equals in the sight of God. And so, whereas the Roman world legally gave husbands the power of life and death over their wives, these household codes say, yes, but what that means is that husbands should give up their lives for their wives. It completely turns it on its head. Instead of saying, yes, you have the right to exercise your power, it says, your right is to give up your power. That is radical. Yeah. And so it's just, and it completely shifts the narrative of them. The emphasis is not on the power of men.
Right. And kind of like how you were saying, how it's amazing how like some of these women have names. It's amazing that the servants like were addressed and
yes,
as part of this and kind of given somewhat of a say. Obviously it's problematic that that it's operating on the assumption that you do have servants, but for its time it is pushing the boundaries, and we just don't see that since we're so far removed.
Right.
Progressive perhaps or pushing the boundaries then has kind of lost that edge now. And like your thesis is that we read our own understandings of gender and power back onto the text.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is why we got so many, 17th, 18th, 19th century folk who believed in slavery, reading these passages to support their own slavery. It's because they were reading their own context into these texts. Yeah. And, I think about Ben Witherington, who said this a long time ago when I heard him speak. He said, a text without a historical context is a pretext to say whatever you want.
Oh,
and
I love that.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah. Well, I asked this question of all my guests. So how would you respond? And, probably this has happened to you, unfortunately, but how would you respond?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If someone said that you were a bad Christian or woman even for believing in egalitarianism and women in church leadership.
Yes, I have had a lot of folk who have said this. Most recently, I had an encounter with a senior editor on Christianity Today who pretty much said this, which was a lot of fun. But on the one hand, I think when people hear that, our response is to be defensive, to be like, what do you, I believe in the gospel of Jesus. Right. It's like, how am I a bad Christian? I believe in scripture. I believe in, the text and the authority of scripture. It's like, how could you tell me I'm a bad pastor? But as I've had time to kind of step away from it, my response is, thinking about this, is I'm not talking to those people. I am not talking to the people who aren't going to hear me and who are going to immediately have this, this sort of this knee-jerk response and say, oh, well, I can discount what she says because she's not a good Christian.
Right.
Those aren't the people who are ready to hear.
Yeah.
Those are the people who are mostly into, they're building their own empires. They have power at stake. They're justifying their own power in some way. So I'm like, okay, I'm not talking to those people. I am talking to the people who are ready to hear. And what that means too is that it doesn't matter what people call me, because what I am trying to do is bigger than me.
Oh.
What I am trying to do is to reach evangelical women who honestly think that God has placed limits on them because of their sex. And I want them to hear that they can reconsider that and still be a faithful Christian. Yeah. And so it's really helped me have perspective on it by realizing that when people say that about me, what they're trying to do is just dismiss me. But it also means that I can't be dismissed. They're having to call me that because they're trying to dismiss me, but that means that what I'm saying is powerful enough that I can't be dismissed. So so I mostly am just like, okay, you can say that. Maybe one day you'll be ready to hear, but you're not now. So I'm just going to leave you alone and let my words talk to the people who are ready to hear.
Yeah. Oh,
so anyway.
Yeah. And along those lines, I mean, you talk about some emotional and difficult topics in your book, particularly in the way that women have been silenced. And you end the book with this beautiful blessing. You say, "Go be free." How do you envision that freedom looking for your readers?
Yeah. So a lot of women who read this book are in churches, are in homes where they cannot easily disentangle themselves, where there's structures in their lives that aren't going to allow them to maybe go to another church, that aren't going to allow them to speak out against this. But what I hope is that my words can lift a burden in their lives, that they are not seen by God as being anything less than the men around them. And that even if they have to remain living in these structures, that has to do with people, not with God.
Right.
And that in God, we are all one in Christ. And I just want them to hear those words, which, I mean, I think they can do a lot of spiritual healing. You are seeing the way that Jesus sees you. Jesus stopped and talked to women, listened to them, and rebuked disciples based on the words of women. And I want them to know that, just regardless of whatever circumstances they're living in. So those words, I think, are the words that God has spoken, that the words that I heard when I finally realized that the limits on me were not God-imposed limits. They were limits of the world. And in Christ, I am free.
Wow.
So.
Man, what a gift. Like, I just encourage everyone to go out and buy a copy of The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And when this podcast is released, all of a sudden I got the idea. I was like, well, we'll have to do like a giveaway, because I just want to give this book to everyone.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. But where else can people find you? I don't know if you have a social media presence or.
Yeah, I do. You can find me. I go Beth Allison Bar almost anywhere. So you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter. I'm most often on Twitter. Also on Instagram, though. I used to mostly just do Instagram, was mostly sort of like my kids and life as a professor. But it's expanded a little bit because I've got all of these people because of the book. So you can also find me on Instagram. But I'm always Beth Allison Bar.
Okay. Yeah. And I think I lied there, because I'm pretty sure I follow you on Instagram, but if not, I will definitely go do that, because I
think you do too, because I saw I've seen posts from you. So yeah.
Okay. Well, as a tradition on the podcast, we often end with a blessing, and of course I'm going to end with your blessing, but would it be okay if I bless you and all of our
please
do
that.
Beth and all of you lovely reviewers and listeners, may you go wrapped in the freedom of this book, and ultimately from the Bible and from God. Know that you are good, and we need to hear your voice. So all of you lovely human beings, may you go and be free. Amen.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, for joining me on this podcast.
Yeah.
Oh man, I could talk all day about the women of the Bible. I love it.
Well, thanks for having me. This has been fun.
Of course. That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.